Thank you for joining me. I'm Pastor J. Dillon Proctor. This is the Nazarene Stream Preacher, and what you've come to right now is a class called Poetry of the Constitution, and this is class number 1 of the beginning, part 1. It's going to be a 12-section series, and this is part 1 of the first little bit here. So thank you for joining me. And as the title might shock you, we're going to be looking at the Constitution of the United States as a poem and not so much as a legal document. There's a reason for that. Life itself is not actually built on formulas and technicalities. If it were, then when God made the heavens and the earth, then it would have never been declared good. That Hebrew word tov, which means something which is beautiful. It's got a little bit of mystery to it because it's pleasing to the eye. It's evocative to the senses. And when you go back and you look at something like the U.S. Constitution, and we're going to be looking at a lot of history, a lot of literature. In fact, this is a class that I'm teaching at the high school level 3 times a week, and it is a literature, Bible, and history class. We're going to be understanding that life is much more than just the raw necessities. There's something mysterious about it. There's something marvelous about it, and it's all quite neat. So thank you for joining me. Let's get to this. Since this is the first class, let me go ahead and declare the purpose and objective of it. The goal of this course is to help us develop an understanding of the U.S. Constitution that is based on comprehension, gratitude, and philosophy. Now, you notice that in that comprehension, gratitude, and philosophy, one thing that is missing is application. And the reason why that's missing is because I think if we actually have some comprehension of it, we're grateful of our heritage, and we understand the philosophy behind us, that will do more to tell us how to apply it than if I just try to sit around and craft formulas hither and thither. I think the application will come naturally if you can get all the background stuff. So the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, they come to you as a gift. If you're out there, you're listening to this came as a gift for you, as a gift to the American citizenry to restrain governmental powers from denying its people life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is written with the necessary recognition of God and His natural law, and natural law is going to be an important thing for us to talk about. And again, we're coming at this from the poetic angle. And insofar as nature, it is not chaotic, but it is rather established with a right and proper order, so also we have rights, which are inherent claims to the right and proper order set forth by providence. Now, to the issue of comprehension, documents like the U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, they are important to read with a certain pace and methodology that soaks in the meanings of their words. The style and vocabulary of such works can easily become overwhelming, and human language is not perfect. However, if we want to really be people who have lasting knowledge, well, first we must have belief. We have to have faith. But we also must value and appreciate what authors meant when they put their words on paper. It is very easy to wish for words to have a different meaning than they actually have and to try to be a little bit wishy-washy and twist things throughout time. But if we want to have stability and not live in chaos, then we must appreciate what words meant when they were written. To the issue of gratitude, it is always easy to dismiss one's heritage, especially if they know very little about it. And this is where things get interesting. Indeed, the past is filled with a lot of sins. We actually should reject certain elements of our heritage. However, we have to honor it. There's a difference between disagreeing with one's heritage and then trying to pull the best out of it and go better, and then just outright despising the past and being someone who is an ingrate, who is rather ungrateful and doing a lot of destructive things. And that's what typically happens in our world. It's easy to be scammed into forsaking your heritage with fine-sounding arguments which appear to depict the past but are actually tragically deceptive. And in fact, a lot of the history that is taught in our world today is very subversive. It's very subversive not only to American history, but also to the history of the church, to the truth and the real content that is contained there in the Holy Bible, and just the history of the world everywhere. History is not taught in the way that it ought to be taught because oftentimes there's so many competing agendas. And I don't claim to have all the answers. I'm just here to present material and pull you hopefully towards the truth. So again, we have to honor our heritage even if we disagree with elements of it, but we must be able to make sound and noble decisions about life, and that means we have honest terms with our heritage and we honor God, we honor our parents, we honor our bloodline. And that's a mysterious thing, and we'll discuss that in time. To the issue of philosophy, in order for the Constitution and Bill of Rights to have serious meaning for a citizen, they must first understand the following. What are rights? What are rights and why are they necessary to the good? Where do rights come from? And how do rights affect a citizen's life? Moreover, to appreciate any of these questions, one must develop a real epistemology, which simply means one must develop a method for determining truth to actually be true. So just a quick overview of the things that we're going to be looking at in case you want to go out and read some material and do as much as you can to really brighten your senses and become familiar with everything around you. We're going to be looking at a lot of documents on the website battlefields.org. That's the one web app that you can kind of go to, and it has a lot of great resources there. In fact, if you go there, it's going to kind of start off appearing to be a different sort of website, but if you go over to, they have a section on learning and education, and you can go to their biographies, and then you can go and look at things under the American Revolution. You kind of got to do some hunting on that website, but there's some great entries about people. We're going to obviously be reading the Constitution and Bill of Rights, so that's a big thing to read. We'll be breaking it down over the 12 different sections of this. We're going to be looking at the Declaration of Independence. We're going to be looking at a lot of the Holy Scriptures. We're going to be reading writings from men like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Samuel Adams. But we're also going to tie back to a lot of the ancient writings like Ion from Plato. We're going to look at something called the Visigothic Code, which is really the first time you see in human history any notion of all people having rights, because they're made in the image of God, and rights come from God. In fact, in our Constitution, we have the language of we the people. You go back to the Visigothic Code, and it has this beautiful line about the glory and majesty of the people. That in fact, if you're a judge, whenever you're going to sit down and make a decision, if you're somebody who is at all in any sort of governmental power, the first thing you must do is reckon with the glory and majesty of the people that are brought before you. So that's a fascinating thing. We'll be talking about the Magna Carta as well, more recent documents like the Mayflower Compact, and also a lot of books like Paradise Lost and Robinson Crusoe. So there's a little bit of an introduction for you, the first 7-8 minutes or so of this, and let's get to lesson 1, shall we? Now, the first section we have in studying the Constitution is the beginning. And so we're going to go to the beginning. And when you go to Genesis 1, we need to understand that what we find in Genesis 1 actually is the natural law. And again, this is going to sound very peculiar to you because I'm using these words in a very poetic sense. And I don't mean poetic in the sense of it being weak or watered down or being somehow remarkably subjective and not being connected to reality. I'm actually using them to describe the mystery of life, which is in fact just about as real, if not more real, than the other things around us. You can't go to the store and buy a box of friendship on the shelf. You can't go to the restaurant and order a plate of love and then find yourself be satisfied. All of these things, they are very real, but yet they're mysterious in how they work with the world. So, in the beginning, when you go to Genesis 1 and just a hair into chapter 2, you see this opening of creation, that is the natural law. It's very common in the church for us to describe Genesis 1 through 3 as two separate accounts of creation. But I think that's a little bit of an error. To be as gracious as possible, I think that's a miscalculation. Because what we find in these two instances of creation, they're not at all in contradiction with one another, but they're actually doing very different but also overlapping things. Genesis 1, where you find the 6 days of creation, and the 7th there in chapter 2, what you find is the natural law. Things that you don't have any choice about. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. The seasons come, the seasons go. You're a fish, you're a bird, you're a man created in the image of God, you're a man or a woman. These things you can't change. And as much as that seems like there's not a lot going on there, there's actually a lot. You get the cause and effect relationships. You put the seed in the ground, out comes a tree according to its kind. Whatever for a man might sow, that he shall also reap. You can go and, of course, read the book of Galatians 6:7 for that. And you also find when it comes to mankind, there are certain impulses and urges that we have. The desire to multiply, not just biologically with children, which is a natural instinct people have. Even when people are sexually deviant, there's still some desire to try to use the senses and pervert things in a way they ought not. But also we want to multiply our hobbies, our habits. We want to say, I really like this band, or I'm really into this social cause, so I'm going to put a bumper sticker on my car because we want to be fruitful and multiply in every endeavor we have. If you're someone like me who likes listening to Maurice Ravel's string quartet in F major, you want other people to do that. If you're also like me and you really love 1991 Ford Rangers, you want other people to enjoy the old square trucks. We want to be fruitful and multiply. We're always looking for dominion. That's things that are part of the natural law. In Genesis 2 and 3, where you have the story of Adam and Eve, what you find is the moral law. Things that you can actually change a little bit. You can choose. Do I want to eat of the fruit of the garden or do I not? Now, it's very different than having the urge to multiply. Again, we all are looking for a way to multiply things. If you didn't have those urges of multiplication, of having dominion over the earth, if you didn't have those, you would go outside and sit nakedly and wait to die. So let's actually begin our study by reading Genesis 1 through 5, and then 27 and 28, and we'll break this down. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness, and called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. What we find here is absolutely beautiful. There's a stark contrast between the void, which is nothing. It's a place without width, breadth, height, depth. It has nothing. You also find this in the book of Revelation. There's the bottomless pit, a place without width, breadth, height, or depth. And then there's the kingdom of heaven, which John will go about measuring even with an angel. You can find out how many cubits high a wall is, how many walls are there, how many gates are there, what are on them. There's a big difference between reality being tethered together with certain rules, certain elements, and then the void, which has nothing. And in Genesis 1, as much as you might think this is just a meaningless poetic myth that you have in Genesis 1 through 5, it's actually telling us a whole lot about how things work. It's telling us also about beauty, about mystery. And I don't mean mystery in this sort of ancient cult way where things are actually rather devilish. I mean mystery in the actual beautiful way, the notions of love, the good, the true, and the beautiful. That's what I mean when I'm talking of mystery. And what we find there is that something is better than nothing. And also, nothing is not a static thing. If you ever leave your house alone, it'll rot. If you don't feed your dog, he'll starve. If you don't take care of yourself, you too will come all to pieces and die. To actually put creation together is very, very difficult. It takes a lot of power. It takes a lot of energy. I mean, this is not a symbol of power. It is power. Things are being created. They're coming together in existence. And what we find here is that God didn't just make the baseline essentials. We're like, okay, well, I wanted to create, so here's just a plain basic rock. It's completely white and creation's over. No. It's dynamic. It's very solid. It's very tangible. You can rely on it. As God's even going to make land. So that way when you fall, you might fall into sin, but you're not going to fall into the void immediately and just explode into a million pieces. You're not going to trip and go into outer space. There's actually very serious and merciful limits on where you can go, and they're reliable. They give you something tangible. And life actually needs tangible barriers around us so that we can exist. Going on to Genesis 1, 27 and 28, just for time purposes. This says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. He created them male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that creeps upon the earth." So what we find about mankind right here is that we are created in the image of God, which means we have some sort of royal station, and we all intuitively know this. In Romans 1, when Paul is writing, he says, the Gentiles, God, even in nature, has revealed enough about himself that they're not able to have an excuse. They're without excuse for being given over to a totally destructive mind, to an undisciplined and destructive mind, being given over to, their reprobate selves. Because nature actually reveals a lot about us, and we actually can't escape this. You might be listening to this and think that I'm just some kook over here on the other side of the microphone who just believes all of this stuff and makes it up. I am someone who believes it all, but I'm not making it up. We all are looking for something to supply us with meaning. On some level, we know that we're special, but we often think that we are the high king of heaven, when in fact we are royal, lesser kings and queens. That's what Adam and Eve are made to be, who rule over earth while they serve the high king. This is why we find idols. We will worship a golden statue. We will worship a beast if it comes out of the sea. We are always hungry to make an idol. And that actually goes all the way back to the fact that we were meant to be in God's image and to bear his image on this earth. And after we entered into sin, that gets fallen and perverted in all sorts of ways. Yet all of the sins that we get into are actually perversions of impulses that God made. God made all the senses. And to quote C.S. Lewis, and I think it's in the Screw Tape Letters where he says, the goal of evil is just to get you to do the good senses in places and at times and excesses and amounts and in ways that they weren't meant to go. And that's how they go from being good to being evil. You take things that God meant for good and you use them for evil, which is, a very, very bad thing. But then again, we do always want to multiply. We want to multiply. We want to have children until we get broken and we pervert even those senses. But then people will want to multiply. Say you are sexually deviant. People want to multiply that. They want to be affirmed in the world, and they want more and more young people. They want to groom, and they want to be pederasts who take the deviancy from one generation and plant it on another. Evil likes to take its whatever wickedness it is and multiply it across. You'll find that people who are victims of domestic violence, other very sad and unfortunate things, they will multiply that themselves a lot of times as adults. They're in fact more likely to be repeat offenders of that than people who weren't victims of it. So we do multiply things, and that's whether it's a sport we like, music, whatever it is, we like to do that. And also we have an urge for dominion. And what happens when we're not keeping God's dominion, we start being tyrants. And so it's inevitable that people will be tyrants if they're sinful. And as we know from Genesis, people are sinful, so that's going to be a big problem. So these are just some early things for us to understand as we begin our understanding of the Constitution today. Again, this is a class on Bible, on history, on literature, and of course the Constitution. And we're beginning with a lot of essential things that are necessary for a well-fortified worldview. So next up, I want us to go to Isidore of Seville's etymologies. Now, Isidore of Seville, he's a guy that lived in the Iberian Peninsula in the ancient world. Spain is now in the Iberian Peninsula, but he's part of a kingdom long ago. He lived in the 5th century, if I can do the numbers right, 400s. And Isidore, he was a man who chronicled everything. Where he is at is kind of the podunk outskirts of the Roman Empire. They're not in between Rome, Jerusalem and Egypt, and even the holdovers of Babylon, Persia, Media, all these things, where you get all these big trade routes going around the Mediterranean. If you're out towards the west, over there where Spain is, you're not in the main circles of trade. There's some, semblances of Roman civilization, but you're on the outskirts. And also in the time when Isidore lives, Rome is on its collapse, and it is collapsing, and it's going to kind of have layered effects across Europe in different ways. But Isidore, he chronicles everything. And he is an ancient encyclopedist. I mean, he's a man of science. He's a man of faith. He unites some of the warring tribes of the Visigoths and the Romans. He does a lot of really interesting stuff. But among his interesting enterprises, he records. And in his book, Etymologies, which is this giant Latin book, you can actually do a search for it, Etymologies PDF by Isidore of Seville. It's about 500 pages, most of the PDFs are, which are translated in English. And yes, it is a book on Latin etymologies, but it tells you so much about the world. And he has an entry on there on what it means to be a human. And you got to ask yourself, what would a man who's kind of the podunk outskirts of Rome, who is torn between elements of Roman society and these warring Visigothic tribes up north, what we think of as the kind of barbaric savages, the Druids before we knew a lot about the Druids, if you're a Roman. These barbaric people who are just utterly savage. What do we think that a man living in that situation would write? How would he define humanity? He's supposed to be one of these ignorant peasants of history who knows nothing of the world. He's just so backwards and uneloquent. And especially since he's on the outskirts, what is he going to write about humanity? Well, Isidore of Seville in Etymologies defines a human being, and of course, he's a Christian. All of this is in the framework that you're a creature of God. But he says the human being is one who prospers by means of intelligence and success in the arts. And by his understanding of things, he either chooses what he ought to do or spurns with reproach what is unprofitable. Now, one of the lines that I've been using in sermons and even some literature and fiction that I've wrote on my own for a while is the idea that the real context of life is we're all looking for the heaven to admire and the hell to repulse. There's always something we're looking for. Even the abortion activists out there, the heaven for them, which is very much a hell, is, killing the babies. That is their thing they admire. And then there's the hell to repulse, which in their case is literally heaven, and they hate anything to do with real Orthodox Christianity. The only use they have of Christianity is how they might subvert it, how they might slip in to the church and give some false teaching therein. And they might go in there and rot the church out and wear its skin as if they are sincere when they're not. But we're always looking for the good to aspire towards and the hell to reject. Even if it's a Sunday afternoon and you're trying to figure out what you're going to eat after church. McDonald's is the hell to repulse. The Mexican restaurant is the heaven to admire, or closest you might have if you're in a little town like we are in Jolton, and really that's your only choice of a sit-down restaurant. But you make these decisions, what is the good wardrobe to put on today? It's smelting hot here in the summer of Tennessee. There's the heaven to admire of nice, clothes that are a little bit airy. And then there's the hell to repulse, the thick things which keep the heat in and don't actually do anything to help cool you. They just smother you. We're always looking for what he chooses he ought to do or spurns with reproach the thing which is unprofitable. Isidore writes in there a version of that, the heaven to admire, the hell to repulse. But the first half of his definition of humanity is one who prospers by means of intelligence and success in the arts. And this is just phenomenal, folks. Out there in Podunk, outskirt of Rome, as Rome is declining and, about to fall, you've got the Visigoth, these proto-Germans, the Aryans, the Nazis, Hitler claimed some connection to the old Aryan race. Well, that kind of has to do with, which I know the Aryans here, the Aryan heretics, but there's some play on words. They're trying to connect themselves back to these ancient peoples in one way or another, even if it's indirect and also largely fictitious. They're trying to have some place here. But you've got the real Aryan heretics here. You've got the just chaos of war between these two very different peoples. And yet a man in the middle of that looks around and says, a human being is one who prospers by means of intelligence and succeeds in the arts. What a phenomenal thing to write. Just soak on that for a little bit, because it's beautiful. In fact, we've been told that the ancients were these ignorant people. They're not. I highly recommend that if you are out there, if you're a righteous man, if you're a Christian leader, the more you read old works, the better. The less you read modern works, the better. We think that we've got it figured out in the modern day and age, but most of our writings, especially most of our theological writings, our systematic theologies, they're abysmal. They're pitifully written. They don't understand reality, and I'm utterly repulsed by all of them. I find them to be completely disgusting. You get back to a lot of the ancient things where people, and it's not just because they're ancient that they're good, it's that the quality of it, the trash has filtered itself out, and the things which have remained are very, very accurate. They understand the poetry of life, which is going to come up when we get to the Constitution. And speaking of the poetry of life, why don't we go ahead and talk about the Mayflower Compact? So the time that I am reading this to you and sharing this class with you, it is August of 2022. Now, in the year 2020, we had the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower Compact, and not a lot was said about that. And then in November of 2021, we had the 400th anniversary of Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is not a holiday about diversity. It's not even really a holiday about, the white Europeans celebrating their friends with the Native Americans, the Indians. It's a holiday about giving thanks. It's quite literally in the name, Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is no small holiday in America either, right? It's no small holiday. But yet, nothing was said about it en masse in our culture. You actually had to be pretty in tune with some very niche historians for anyone to say anything about the 400th anniversary of Thanksgiving. You got to ask yourself why. The consumeristic world, if that's really still a thing, should have had, you go in your local Dollar Tree or Walmart and there's balloons that say 400, paper plates that say 400. The number 400 is everywhere. Text hashtag 400 and you'll get, 40 cents off of your meal at, Dairy Queen or something. It should have been everywhere in our culture, and it wasn't. It was ignored. It's not something that's hard to find out, by the way. It's actually very easy to discover that we were at the 400th year. And ask yourself, why was it ignored? Did just all the smart people, all the people who run the big, news talking points, the people who put together the special programs on all the public television and major broadcasting, or did they just overlook that? There's actually no good explanation for that. There's only evil explanations for that, and we're about to find out why. They did not want to try to rebrand Thanksgiving. There's been this attempt to rebrand Thanksgiving as sort of a diversity, inclusive holiday, even though that's not what it is. It's literally Thanksgiving to God. But one of the reasons they don't even push that very hard while they choose to ignore it is because if you open up the box of Thanksgiving at all, you open up the letter of the Mayflower Compact, you're going to quickly find that America is, in fact, a Christian nation. There's no way to subvert the Mayflower Compact. I'm going to read it to you, and you're going to find out. You're going to find out why it has been ignored. As C.S. Lewis writes in Uncle Screwtape, the Screwtape Letters, the best thing that you can do is actually not argue. If you argue, you might awaken the reasoning part of a man, and that belongs to God. If a man starts reasoning, he might end up at the truth. There's no way to turn the Mayflower Compact into something that it's not. The Mayflower Compact opens up saying, "In the name of God, amen." In the name of God, amen. We whose names are here underwritten, the loyal subjects of the dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, of Ireland, defender of the faith, and etc., we have undertaken for the glory of God and to the advancement of the Christian faith, in honor of king and country, a voyage. A voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. We do here, and by these precepts, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by the virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we all promise our due submission and obedience. This is written. And again, when you understand the writing of this, it's in the name of God, amen. For the glory of God and to the advancement of the Christian faith. When you read down in there, they say we are forming together into a civil body politic for the furtherance of the ends aforesaid. What are the ends? Why did they come here? They came here in the name of God, for the glory of God, and the advancement of the Christian faith. They're planning a colony. The colony is going to be under these three categories: the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, and honor of king and country. And king and country is an interesting bit of language too, because in the old world, this should still be prevalent today, but it's largely lost. There was this large kinship you had with your fellow countrymen. You kind of understood that in life, we actually consent to very little things. We don't consent to the natural law. We don't consent to the time in which we live. We don't consent to the place in which we're born. And God gives you certain talents in life. This is, Matthew 25, the parable of the talents. Some slaves get 5, some get 2, some get 1, some might get 100, some might get a quarter of a talent. You're not asked to answer for any more talents than what you're given. Well, part of the talents we're given in life is the nation in which we're born. You have some obligation to king and country, even if your king is a tyrant. And again, the Mayflower Compact, they are leaving King James. King James, they think very lowly of King James. However, when they say king and country, they're referring to this honor we have to our fellow man. That in the honor of our fellow man, that is hopefully somewhere down the line, maybe it's our great-grandchildren, or maybe our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren, they will have a society where the Christian faith truly unfolds in a blissful way. You cannot read the Mayflower Compact as a document about inclusivity or diversity, especially as those words are meant today. They're basically, they are the unholy language of an anti-Christian belief system. In Christianity, we talk about things like holiness, righteousness. You might open up Philippians 4:8 and talk about whatsoever is noble. Nobility. That word's gone. I mean, you might quote Philippians 4:8 exactly and say, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is beautiful and lovely, whatever is of good report, whatever is commendable, venerable, and worthy of praise. Meditate, focus on these things. Those are biblical virtues. This other language that we have in is very much anti-Christian. Now, it preys on some shallow Christian sensibilities, but it's actually meant to subvert Christianity and replace it with something very heinous. There's no way to twist the Mayflower Compact into something other than a Christian document. So the reason why this document is ignored is because if you do anything, if you have a big celebration about the 400th year of Thanksgiving, there's really only one piece of history that goes with it as far as written documents go, and that is the Mayflower Compact. They didn't have all of these other things. There's not like a bunch of letters and, Thomas Paine, he has his pamphlets and things. It's not even like you have someone like Samuel Adams Sr., who's a pastor. You don't have like his sermons in the pulpit. You literally have these group of people who have come over here and they've put together this document, the Mayflower Compact. That is the text that goes with them, right? And so if you're a subversive who wants to pretend like America, and this is where history we've been lied to. We've been lied to that people came to America fleeing religion. They came here from freedom, for religious freedom, meaning there's kind of this subversive idea that they were running away from religion. No, they weren't. They were running to the Christian faith. They were not running away from the Christian faith. They were running away from administrators, bureaucrats in the church, figureheads in the church, which Christ is supposed to be the head of the church, but worldly corruptions which had rotted their way into the church and were wearing the church as their clothing. There was some sort of zombie, if you can just kind of use that illustration, some sort of undead thing which had come in there to rot out and corrupt the church. They were running away from fake Christianity and towards real Christianity. And the Mayflower Compact is very clear about that. But then that other language in there, when you actually get to the poetry of this and you understand the humanity of it, you might read there that they're undertaking a voyage to the northernmost part of Virginia. That sounds great. You can say, okay, let's get out our map. We're going to look at the longitude and latitude. We're going to find out what parallel they crossed on what day. The journey of the Mayflower is not a technical voyage. This is in the age of exploration. People understood that even if you go out with the blessing of the King of Portugal, or maybe you are commissioned by Great Britain, you're not actually running away from King James, but King James summons you in there and says, I will send you out with the best ships in the wonderful British Armada. We will send you out, right? It was understood that you may never be seen again. Captain Cook, a famous explorer, he ends up there on the shores of Hawaii. He vanishes. And later they find out he pretended to be a god when they showed up on Hawaii. They played along. The Hawaiians were like, these strange white people, they must be gods. Captain Cook played along with it. And then they turned around and ate him for being, his sin got turned around right back on him. Making an idol of yourself was paid back with being eaten. It was understood that you would vanish. A lot of people would die. And that was even if you had a fancy ship with brilliant captains, things that are seaworthy. The Mayflower, she is a little 170-ton merchant vessel. She's not made to cross over the Atlantic. And the shape of the hull is actually quite different. The draft they have, the design of the sails, it's all quite different. The Mayflower is a little merchant vessel meant to just dot around, carrying a thing hither and thither in Europe. When you understand the poetry of life, this voyage to Virginia, they knew that they were probably going to die. It wasn't a surprise to them that half of them died the first winter. It's understood that we are taking a voyage where we may never be heard of again. We don't even have some grand, glorious captain. William Brewster, who's often talked about as being the pastor, he's not actually a pastor. He's something more like a Sunday school teacher. This really is a ragtag band of people who have a pitiful little ship, to kind of use in language and to get away from the leagues, the fathoms, and the cable's length, and all these beautiful things that I love to talk about. The ship is like 30 foot wide. The church where I pastor, Jolton Church of the Nazarene, doesn't have a large sanctuary, but like our sanctuary is the width and length of the Mayflower. It's actually a tiny little vessel. And it's one that's not made for this sort of travel. And yet these people, they come together. They understood John 15:13. No greater love than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. These people, they were laying down their lives so that somewhere in the end, the furtherance of the ends they foresaid, that people, for the glory of God, the advancement of the Christian faith, for their king and country, that their children, their grandchildren, somewhere down the line of descendants, they might have a beautiful society. This is a marvelous thing. In Psalm 94:5, the psalmist asks God, "How long shall they afflict thine heritage?" We have afflicted our heritage. We have afflicted God's heritage. Isidore of Seville, a great man of the faith, says, humanity is one who succeeds in the arts, that prosper with intelligence. The virtue you see exemplified on the Mayflower is phenomenal. It truly is one of the boldest, most heroic enterprises undertaken in human history. And yet it is despised and ignored. Let's read the preamble to the Constitution, shall we? The Constitution says, "We, the people of these United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty, to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." In older forms of English, which again, even King James Bible is still modern English. We're not back in Anglo-Saxon territory. But they used capital letters better. We live in the age of everything is lowercase. We even want to use lowercase pronouns for God. We want a lowercase Bible in Scripture. We lowercase everything because we live lowercase lives. We're not profound in any way. The church has become an elaborate Hillsong concert. We've moved away from the powerful organs whose terrible music rains down on you, and you are reminded every time you hear those pipes, that great induction of the hymns and harmonies come and strike you down. It is like thunder and lightning, reminding you that the throne of God is dangerous, that the seraphs who tend God, they have to cover their feet, their face, their eyes. When Isaiah looks at God, he is unmade. His body is unsown. And the only way that he can be repaired is if a hot coal, a real burning, scorching coal, is put on his mouth. When John is in heaven in the book of Revelation, he glances at the throne. It is something like a rainbow of emerald that illuminates it and radiates around it. And then from it comes these booms of thunder, these peals of lightning. We have forgotten that God is dangerous. And we've forgotten that goodness itself is dangerous. When we read the preamble, first of all, we need to understand, I want us to read this not as a legal document, but as a poem. And in order for me to articulate that, because you're going to think that I'm just kind of this weird nerd over here who didn't get enough swirlies in high school, the reason why I'm saying this is life is mysterious. If we read this as a legal technical document, we're going to try to weasel our way around it. We're going to miss the point. We're going to miss the element of life. We have to understand God created the world to be good. Now it's fallen. It's not everything is inherently good. In fact, there's very few things, but specific things are prescribed as being inherently good. You find that in Genesis 1. Life is good. Having children is good. But the world itself is going to melt away in the end. The world has been filled with tyrants, fiends, monsters, leaders, rulers of corporations that hate the people beneath them, nobles who hate the peasants of their field. These are real phenomena. They're real phenomena. And when they open this up saying, "We the people of the United States," they're making an observation about who actually has the authority here. Then they have capital letters, in order, capital O order. The poetry of the Constitution recognizes the natural law, that there are certain elements of life which you can and must recognize. Now, we've entered into a second American experiment. The first American experiment is the Mayflower Compact. A nation, in the name of God, for the glory of God, and to the advancement of the Christian faith. That's the Mayflower Compact, the real first American experiment. The second American experiment is, we're on the Mayflower. We now hate God, which means we hate the wind that he created. So we're going to cut up our sails. We're going to despise our history, our heritage. And so we're stuck in this place where we're just drifting along. We're no longer connected to the wind. And we think that because we've got some momentum, it's going to work. We buy into these libertarian and progressive ideas, and even fake conservative ideas, that, we can just grift. I really love eating this apple, but I hate the tree. The tree is Christ Jesus. The apple is things like the First Amendment, freedom of speech. You do not have freedom of speech without concepts like Matthew 9:9, where Jesus saw a man called Matthew. Freedom of speech is a uniquely Christian idea, and it requires a real New Testament understanding. We think we can enjoy the fruit while despising the tree, which again violates the natural law. It violates that capital O order. You want certain trees? Well, plant seeds in the ground and they'll come forth new trees according to their kind. The creeping things, the creatures that creep about the earth, they bear fruit and multiply. The wolves have wolves according to their kind. The birds according to their kind. Fish according to their kind. We're going to do a longer study on the preamble as we go through this. This first one is just kind of looking at things a little bit. But you'll notice that it says a more perfect union. When you go back and you read a lot of Thomas Paine's writings, and whether you look at the age of reason or common sense, he kind of calls out the fact that there was an understanding in Great Britain that you have in the English system a union of kind of the monarchy and then the house over there. You've kind of got some sort of legislature which is separate from the executive branch, to kind of use some modern English language or modern American language. There's a lot of similarities linguistically between the American and British system, so it gets really confusing pretty quickly. And y'all also forgive me, I'm doing a lot of this as a live stream, and it's easy to get tongue-tied. But they kind of had this idea of the union where you've got these different branches of government that kind of hold one another in check, and they obviously don't. It's not a perfect union at all. So when you talk about a more perfect union, there's a lot of layers to this. On one hand, they understand anytime you try to look for a perfect utopia, you're not going to have one, and you're going to create hell. We saw this in the 20th century. You see it even currently in places like communist China, but you also saw it in Soviet Russia, communist Russia. You saw this attempt to create a perfect society, and it turns disastrous. You have to starve people. You have to put people in gulags. It always requires that. But they understood a more perfect union that's a very aspirational statement. It's striving towards the perfect, understanding that since we live after Eden and Christ has not yet judged the living and the dead, we're not actually going to see that level of perfection yet. But then also, this is more perfect than specifically the sort of phony unions that you saw going on in the British system. So that's important. Next up, you get established justice. Justice is one of the cardinal virtues. They're establishing it here, this order, this idea that you're recognizing the right order, things of that, so forth. Next up, you've got ensuring domestic tranquility. Tranquility, that T is capitalized. Again, you can't guarantee domestic tranquility, but they're trying to have some insurance for it. It's very interesting language. Next, you've got provide for the common defense. Again, you can't guarantee the common defense, but you can provide for it and try your best to make it there. Next up, promote the general welfare. Again, welfare is capitalized. You cannot assure the general welfare, but you can promote it. It's actually not something the government can do, is provide the general welfare, but they can kind of promote it. And finally, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. What you get with this is they actually can secure that by restraining governmental forces. That was the whole idea, that we would restrain governmental forces, because that's where the tyranny often lies. When you go and you read the Visigothic Code, and we will spend some time with that, the whole thing is written against the lawlessness of the lawmakers. It reminds us very much again of Psalm 94, where when you get towards the end of that, I think it's Psalm 94:20, it says, Lord, these people, they frame their mischief by a law. It's actually the lawmakers who are the most wicked when it comes to breaking laws. They're the most criminal. They're a lot like in the book of Daniel, chapter 6, where you have these advisors, these counselors to King Darius, and they come up with this stupid law just so they can throw Daniel into the lion's den. And it happens against Darius's will. So the way you secure that is you actually restrain government. Now, our modern world is completely backwards. The whole premise of fact-checking is wrong. The notion of fact-checking is that the smart experts need to keep you, the peasants, in check. An honest version of fact-checking would never be concerned with what the peasants say, but be entirely concerned with what the government says, what the heads of corporations say. It would be holding the aristocracy accountable. Real fact-checking that was actually consistent with the blessings of liberty, as we find here in the preamble of the Constitution. Again, when you understand the poetry of life, this is meant to keep the elites in check, because that's actually how you do that. Now, in our modern world, it's completely inverted. We do not live under the Constitution or Mayflower Compact at all anymore. We don't live in a Christian nation. And what you see happening here is that it's all inverted. The peasants need to be chastised and kept in order. So the final statement is we do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. Now, they use the language of ordain. This is a bit of a human term to say, like, we've laid hands on it, but there's also a religious conviction that is associated with that. And you can try to technically weasel out of that, but you're being dishonest with history. There is a religious, specifically Christian connotation to this word. And so, since it is a common thing that people use Roman 13s to depress the population, right? At a lot of the center of the modern heresies and the modern corruptions in the church is that we want to do everything we can to depress the righteous, to have them demoralized and dispirited, and encourage the wicked within the church. Anybody who adheres to biblical orthodoxy, we want to restrain them back. Like, hold on, the smart, furrowed-browed people will settle it out. And then they want to give as much, liberty to the progressives as possible. And when it comes to interpreting any amount of scripture, like we'll take the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, where it opens up saying, you hypocrite, how can you be worried about a speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your own eye? That scripture is not actually meant to make you clutch at your pearls and go back and hide in your house and say, "Oh, I can't go outside because I've got a log in my eye." I would hate to condemn myself. It's actually meant to get your life together with Jesus. You're supposed to get the log out of your eye and then go out and do wonderful things in the world. It's not meant to be a depressant. It's meant to stimulate you. It's not meant to make you go hide and cower and say, "Oh, I can't speak about sin because I've got a log in my own." It's actually supposed to remind you that, hey, actually, all of you are sinners. And it's because you're sinners that you must call out sin. Because sin is actually destructive. You're to become self-aware of how destructive sin is. Get yourself out of the deep miry clay and pull everyone out with you. It's not a depressant, it's a stimulant. But in the modern corruption and cowardice of the church, we treat everything like a depressant. And when it comes to Romans 13, we get it entirely wrong because we forget the natural law. In Romans 13, it says, "Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there is no power but of God, the powers that are ordained of God." Now, a lot of people will read this and say, well, that means we got to bow down to everything the government says. Paul, who wrote this, did not bow down to everything the government said. In Rome, you had the Pax Deorum, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, the peace of the gods. One of them meant you had to do certain things to again, appease Caesar and kind of the official administration. But the other was you appease the gods of Rome, the officially approved gods of Rome. Which means, quite literally, it's required by law that you go and fornicate in the temples. And if you don't do that at some point in time in your life, somebody can take you before a judge and accuse you of atheism. You can be killed. A lot of early Christians were accused of atheism and killed because they broke the Pax Deorum. Did Jesus go and fornicate in the temples? He's living in the Roman Empire. Does Paul go and fornicate in the temples? He's also living in the Roman Empire. No, they don't. It's interesting, the same people that say you must obey everything that a government official does, how many of those people also say that wives should submit to their husbands? Do those people also say that? Do they come and clutch their pearls and say, "Oh, modern female, you must also, I've read there in 1 Peter, chapter 3, you've got to submit to your husbands." So they say that? No, they don't. They pick and choose. They take the most depressed thing. But what's interesting about all of these things, it's actually the same concept between husbands, wives, fathers, children, and leaders of the nations. They're not making a moral judgment that every leader is righteous or that every father is righteous in his household. Again, you look Old and New Testament, it's actually hard-pressed to find a good father. We often complain at Mother's Day. I'll hear the progressives say it's very hard to find, good mothers in the Bible because it's sexist or something ridiculous like that. It's a ridiculous notion. It's also very hard to find good fathers. I think Samson's parents in Judges 13 are some of the most innocent and blissful people that I know in all of Scripture. But what we find here is a structure. Verse 2 of Romans 13 says, "Whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, that they shall receive themselves damnation." God created a structure to restrain evil and also to dish out responsibility and talents. If you don't want to have a lot of responsibility, if you're not a man of courage, don't accept leadership. God's order is those with leadership have great responsibility. This is, the Spider-Man quote, "With great power comes great responsibility," but it's also a biblical notion. You can find elements of it there in the story of Cain. If you do well, you'll be accepted, but it's also explicitly stated many times. You look there in Ezekiel 33, the whole idea of the watchman on the wall. If you're going to be a watchman on the wall, you better blow the horn. If you fail your people and you choose not to blow the horn, their blood's on your head. Luke 12:48, "To whomsoever much is given, much is also expected." If you don't want to have to answer for more responsibility, don't accept it. It's also in 2 Peter 2. It's better that you never knew the truth than that you knew the truth and didn't act on it. You turned a blind eye. You walked away from it. So what we find here is that there's an order to the power. Doesn't mean that every king is righteous or even worthy of that. Coincidentally, we're going to get that explained here. Verse 3, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Will thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise the same. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, and a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must be needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore all their duties, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear is due, honor to whom honor is due, and owe no man anything, but to love one another, for he that loveth one another hath fulfilled the law. Again, this is not giving you a ruling that every father of the household is righteous. We can obviously know that's true. It's not saying every king is righteous. It's telling you the order. And by that I mean the design. The design is for the kings to be righteous. Now, a lot of them are going to fail. The design is that men will step up to the plate. A lot of time we're passive like Adam in the garden, and we don't step up to the plate. That happens. But the design is Adam was supposed to be a high T male who would step up to the plate. He has testosterone. He's supposed to actually be angry when the serpent comes and talks to his wife. Instead of living in that anger, he takes those hormones of the moment, picks up the snake, tosses him out. Romans 13, if you actually apply that honestly, we the people are due respect. The way that our system is set up, and by the way, when you get to the Declaration of Independence, they say, judge us. The closing argument of the Declaration of Independence includes this item that they're appealing to the supreme judge of the universe, that he would come and judge and look at with rectitude of their intentions. I'm going to mess up putting it together and also trying to paraphrase it into a more modern sentence. But they invoke God to come and judge them, that if they are corrupt, they would be smote. So it's a very important thing. In America, the elected representatives, they're supposed to be public servants. The fact checkers are supposed to be fact checking them, not you. They should never be fact checking you. But they do, because they are actually breaking Romans 13. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, or to petition the government for a redress of grievances. There's so much to talk about in this. First of all, America is a Christian nation. This is not saying what people think this is. And this amendment is broken, specifically that first line, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. If you take away the word religion, and you replace it with the word belief system, you'll see that they're affecting a belief system all the time. The Pride movement is now effectively the new state-enforced religion. We're all but there. In fact, we really are there. We're in the age of state-enforced homosexuality now. And that doesn't mean that they come in your house and force you to fornicate, though I'm not going to take that one off the table, but we are at the point where you must affirm it. We've gone from toleration to now affirming it. And you must. And again, you even see when you watch the series of events, you again understand the poetry of life. When you saw how the church was forced to cut down and close down during the Rona, not every church did that. I am proud to say that we did not. When it comes to things like monkeypox, they will not call out the fornications that lead to that, because that is now the protected religion. Scientism is another form of protected religion. Elitism, all the other things, these belief systems that you just trust the experts because they're the experts, all this stuff. Congress is not supposed to establish the belief system. Again, it's not actually capable of it. The church is supposed to do that, and the church has given over the realm of morality to the government, and that's led to a lot of corruption. And G.K. Chesterton predicted this 100 years ago. I can't remember if it's in his book Orthodoxy or Heretics, but that you would find a ton of people, and he predicted it coming out of the educational institutions. They would be fighting for religions that had no name. And in fact, it would be a useful tool for the religions to not have a name. If it came out as a cult like Heaven's Gate or whatever, think of your cult from history, Montanus and Maximilian Priscillus, Montanism cult of the ancient world, the New Prophecy, that's what it was called. Whether it's called the New Prophecy in the ancient world or it's called Heaven's Gate in the modern world, If it turns out to be a cult like that, people identify it pretty quickly. They say, oh, that's clearly a cult. Get them going. If you have all the elements of a cult, the symbols, the beginning, the end times, you've got symbols, I can put something on and that shows me that I'm part of it. I can look over there and they don't have it on, so I know they're not part of it. All these elements of religion, but you never give it that name religion. It's a lot harder to fight. And again, when you understand the Constitution as a technical document, you'll say, well, they didn't call themselves a religion, so I guess we got to enforce their morality. If you understand the poetry of life and you understand that just because they don't have the name religion, the Pride movement, the abortion movement, the environmental movement, the climate change movement, all of these things are very much religions. Suddenly you realize that, hey, we are actually using the government to advance these anti-Christian religions. When you understand the poetry of life, you will recognize that and you'll understand what this amendment was meant to say. If you just look at it as a legal document, you could jump through the loopholes. The free exercise of and the peaceably right to assemble, these are very fascinating things. This is actually, we don't talk about travel. I've been suspicious of the electric car movement for a while because they don't free you. I have a ton of electric power tools, a lot of Ryobi tools to be specific. The Ryobi tools, they're here to free me. The electric car is here to rule me. I hate a two-stroke engine. I don't like working on them. I don't like pulling my shoulder out of socket to start them. I like to be able to pick up the chainsaw, push the button, and it works. Works on a 40-volt battery. You know what? Yeah, I do have to change out that battery. Mr. Groundskeeper over at the church, I know I have to change out the battery 4 times to do the job, but my shoulder doesn't work. It's not loud. And I feel like I'm freed with it. The electric cars, as someone who works on a lot of automobiles, they are not freeing. There's an excess of technology on them, and they are controlled way too much with updates. Again, I'm not even going to go down the rabbit trail of they can shut your car off remotely, though I think that's a very legitimate concern. But just even the idea of, I just got a new phone, didn't really want to get a new phone. The other phone I had was a 6-year-old S8 Plus, or 5 or 6 years old, something like that. And the updates on the phone continued to make it worse. And it just got to the point where the updating of the technology made it worse. The computer that I'm using right now, there was an update that Windows put out. And it's an all-in-one PC, so it has just a touchscreen as its main interface, unless you plug in a keyboard or something. But the touchscreen quit working. The update actually messed up the touchscreen. You had to go in there and do a lot of backdoor stuff to well, it actually wasn't that complicated. You just told the computer to undo all of its USB drivers and then reinstall them, and it somehow figured out the touchscreen again. But I've also seen the BIOS get messed up in a computer. The integral framework of it from updates. And if you've had technology, you know that the updates are a nuisance. They're not actually a help. And that is a problem with electric cars. My electric chainsaw, or I've got a ton of tools. Name it. I've probably got an electric 40 volt or 18 volt version of it. They don't need updates. I'm suspicious of the cars. And one of the reasons why is people need the ability to peaceably assemble. One of the big difference, and Thomas Jefferson made a point of this, is that Europe was urbanized. America was rural. And if America ever became urbanized, that would be the end of it. Now, there's a big push to get us in the city. And that actually changes your psychology being in the city. You're a lot more fearful of crime when you're in the city. And not just because there's more crime there. There is a reason why there's more crime there. We're not going to get into that right now. But, if somebody shoots a firearm in the apartment above you, that's a big deal. If you're out here in the woods where I live and somebody shoots a firearm, it's not a big deal. And even regardless of your opinion of firearms, there's a natural tendency that people have to become more fearful in the city. They also become more impulsive. It's easier to go out and do your sexual fornication. It's easier to go out and have your prostitute. Now, again, you're not more righteous just because you live in the country. But the city format is designed for vices. The country format is designed to keep you connected with nature. That's just a fact. And Thomas Jefferson understood that the more rural and ruralized, that's a hard word to say. Rural is hard to say. Ruralized is a really hard word to say. The more ruralized America is, the more likely it is to be able to govern itself and appreciate things like the natural law. The more it becomes urban, the more it's going to collapse and turn into the corruption of Europe. And that's entirely true. It is entirely true. We're seeing movements to keep people from peaceably assembling. Facebook, the online stuff, they'll disband a group they don't like. I'm doing this live on Rumble right now because they don't want you to be able to freely exercise and peaceably use your speech. And now you might say, well, Facebook's a private company. I'm not here for the technicality, the poetry of life. Evil is where evil goes. If the tyrant thug that wants to ruin you is Harry, I think his name is actually Harry Potter, like the J.K. Rowling novels, Mr. Potter from the movie It's a Wonderful Life. He's just a banker. If the banker wants to rule your life or even murder you, you're not going to be there in your coffin and say, well, it wasn't the government that killed me, so it didn't matter. Evil is where evil goes. I don't care whether the tyrants fly under the flag of a nation or they fly under the brand of a company. They're the same sinners. Things are not uniquely evil because the government does them. They're evil because of the merits of evil. The poetry of this is people have a tongue. God made man with a tongue. In order to stop him from speaking, you have to cut it out or exile him in some way. The poetry of life tells us you should be able to freely exercise your speech. And hey, if Facebook doesn't want to be the public forum, and it does, it wants to create a false reality. If it doesn't want to be the public forum for that, it is free to do that. It's a private company. It can become a publisher. But then it doesn't get to sell people's data. Like right now, it's getting both worlds. It's pretending to be a place of free speech. And that actually is a problem. This is with all the social media problems, or social media companies. They're pretending to be a place of free speech, and that causes you to come there. They want you to come into their arena, and they're selling you a falsehood. And this also ties into the electric cars and other stuff like that, even with such simple reasons as updates. Regarding the press and grievances, a lot of the founding fathers, they wrote pamphlets. They did write propaganda of their own to put out in the streets and plastered on walls. I love Daniel Defoe. We're going to get into Robinson Crusoe here in a moment, actually. Daniel Defoe, really the first novel. It's a beautiful book. If you're listening to this on CastBox, go up there to your CastBox search and search for The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe and listen to the book. If you're not listening to this on CastBox, go find the free LibriVox has a free version of it that you can listen to. Listen to this book. It's very important to understanding older ways of thought. Daniel Defoe spends time in prison. A lot of people spend time in jail and prison over writing. When they write this amendment about the freedom of the press, there's a reason. They sent envoys to King George, and he ignored them. He would not address their grievances. We need to understand, if you're familiar with Batman and sort of the DC universe, Batman has not come about because of the crime. It's not the villains that cause Batman to come about. It's actually the failures of the police and the politicians that produce a Batman. What produced the American Revolution wasn't that there were just one tribe over here and one tribe over there, and they had their differences. People are like that all the time. What created the problem is they were being sold hope by the British government that they were not getting at all. There were all of these systems which were supposed to aid them. They were paying taxes. They're our fellow countrymen. We have success in intelligence and by way of the arts. We're supposed to be part of the same culture. But you're not. You're tethered to them. They extract all of the resources from you as if you're with them. They won't let you go. And yet you reap none of the benefits of it. It's the same problem you see with Facebook. You have all the bad negatives of being on their platform, but none of the free speech, actually. But you're kind of forced to be there. Because realistically, it's very hard to go anywhere else. Though I'm personally of the opinion that I think the internet has not been a net good. I don't think, I mean, it's a tool, so it doesn't have moral value, but I think it's been a tool largely for evil. Let's get down to, we're, an hour and 10 minutes into this? I haven't even actually read my lesson yet. I've just kind of gone over some of the course material. I do have a 3-paragraph lesson for this, so it's actually pretty short. Let's talk about rights. Very few people in our modern world know what rights are. Since this is a class that is looking at the poetry of the Constitution, I'm going to posit you the poetic definition of rights. Rights are our claim to the providential order. Providence means the hand of God. The providential order is that order of nature which God's hand has provided. God's hand provided you this. Rights are our claim to the providential order. Moreover, and just to expand on that, there are declarations about how one is made, and therefore what is just for them to pursue. There are claims to that order which existed long before us. Gravity exists before us. Gravity is not there if I drop the ink pen. It's not there because you agree with it or disagree with it. We've been sold a lot of falsehood. Our modern world tells us bias is very important. It's actually not that important. Sincerity matters more and the motive you have than the bias. If a mother's in the hospital with a child, her bias towards that child is actually very good. It's not a negative thing at all. The doctor comes in. The mother doesn't actually care what way the bias is one way or another as long as he can effectively help the child, right? Bias is largely irrelevant. We're taught to think on those terms. We're also taught to think using language of like equality. Even setting aside the dispute about equality versus equity, that's still an economic term. It doesn't actually supply people with meaning. Take 10 people, give them all equality in a room, and then ask yourself, are they happy? Do they sleep well at night? Are they miserable? Are they cleansed of their sins? Equality tells you nothing about it. Bias tells you nothing about it. We're taught to think on all these flawed terms. But when you understand how we're made and our claim to the things which existed before us, meaning you're a man, you have certain potential inherent to you. You're not guaranteed to fulfill that potential, but you do have the opportunity to pursue it. That potential which existed before you, it is with you in the present, and it's in no way prepared to end with your passing. If man has a tongue, he may speak. Only by removing his tongue can he be stopped. He has a unique soul. He has a degree of sovereignty that is given to him, that he might defend against what is evil and pursue that which is good. Rights are in no way a claim to a given result. So whenever people think you've got a right to health care or whatever, no, it doesn't work that way. It's not a claim to a given result. They do not even guarantee achievement, peace, or anything of comfort, but rather, life is a travail. Life is a difficult adventure. And rights are declaration that a soul has its proper place in the order of creation, and thus a claim to labor towards the good. And to establish any amount of true thought, we must consider the foundations. And there must be a foundation, something reliable on which to build. Without the foundation of providence, rights are always whimsical. If they don't come from God, they're going to be blowing in the wind of the moment. Now, historically, rights have been altogether buried, meaning they were there all along, but they're mostly hidden throughout the larger part of human history. And they're so hidden from daily life that misery just abounds. Now, it has happened in the rare hours of history when providence is recognized above all other foundations of society, and that is when rights shine and prosperity abounds. So that's where we're going to wrap up our introduction, the beginning, part 1. We're not over with this podcast, though, because, like I said, this is a class that I'm teaching on not just Bible, Constitution, and history, but also very much literature. Literature is the way to well-established thought. If you would have come to me at age 20 and told me that at age 30 I would be defending the King James Bible, I would have laughed, but yet here I am. And why did I come back to the King James Bible? Well, actually, it was actually a hunger for good, well-written English that pulled me back there. The King James Bible is the finest craftsmanship of English ever put together. And as far as, I mean, but it's Holy Writ. The Bible is Holy Writ. So you can't even classify it with other literature. But when it comes to other literature, I think Paradise Lost, the great poem by John Milton, the 1674 version of it, the second version he put out, is the greatest writing of English literature ever. Again, it's not Holy Writ, and I don't claim that it is, but it's beautiful. And now as we get to our literature portion of this, we're going to be talking about what is really the first novel in history, Robinson Crusoe, The Life and Adventures of Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe is an interesting man. He's obviously British. He lives in the early 1700s. He is a Presbyterian. He spends time defending the crown at some point in time because the king, the royal bloodline is not entirely English, and he defends them. There's some hatred of him for not being English. Daniel Defoe defends that. But then there are other times where Daniel Defoe is quite honestly put in jail. The same people that he'll sometimes defend will turn around and put him in jail. And that's often how things work in real life. He is known for writing wherever, God erects a chapel. Whenever God puts a chapel somewhere, the devil will build a chapel there too. And you'll find that the congregation of the latter is larger. In other words, the devil's congregation is larger than that of the righteous, that of God's. But his book Robinson Crusoe is about a man that's cast away. It's most likely based on the life of a man named Alexander Selkirk, who lived in the 1600s, or excuse me, in the 1500s. 1600s, yes. About 100 years before Daniel Defoe. Getting my dates mixed up. Daniel Defoe writes The Life and Adventure of Robinson Crusoe in, I think, 1719. But there's a man that actually was shipwrecked, and we're not going to get to the story of his life. We're just going to look at Robinson Crusoe for today. So again, go out, check out this book, buy a copy of it. Go to the LibriVox recording on CastBox and read it. Listen to it. Looking early on in this book, there's an interesting argument made about the middle class. This is another one of those places where we've been lied to about history. Robinson Crusoe's father sits down Robinson Crusoe as a young man, and he tells him, you don't want to go off and be an adventurous sailor. That you'll find that the calamities of life are shared among the highest and lowest parts of mankind. It's the royals and the peasants who have all the calamities. But the middle station, what we often call in the modern world the middle class, that is the place that has the fewest disasters. And it's not exposed to so many of the vicissitudes because of the higher or lower part of mankind. Kings have really difficult jobs. Yes, they are largely corrupt. But even if they're righteous kings, it's really hard to manage things on that level. The stakes are so high, again, to whomsoever much is expected, much is required. Or whomsoever much is given, much is required. There's a lot of calamities in being at the top. Don't accept that mantle if you're not capable of it. At the lower end, you might find yourself starving day to day. What's funny, this language of the middle class is actually a biblical concept. When you go to Alger, the son of Jacques, that's in Proverbs 30, this proverb right here, he makes a statement that's really interesting. In Proverbs 30, verse 7, he says, 2 things I require of thee, and deny them not before me, before I die. And in verse 8 he says, give me neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with food convenient for me. Because if I am full, if I am rich, I will deny thee and say, who is the Lord? Or if I am poor, I will steal, and I will take the name of my God in vain. We see this in our modern world. This idea that if someone is in any way a victim, they're oppressed, that they're somehow the innocent one just because they're at the bottom. You hear phony definitions about racism say, well, if you don't have power, you can't be racist. It's not possible for the oppressed person to hate the person above them. They will literally say this. Actually, that is entirely erroneous. Alger very clearly says, no. In fact, I'm aware of the fact that if you were at the bottom of society, you might be riddled with monstrous levels of covetousness. I don't want to be there because I'm going to become a monster if I'm poor. I don't want to be at the top either because I'm going to become arrogant. I need to be held in that careful tension where there's enough that I don't turn to criminality to feed my belly and then try to justify it, but not too much that I become comfortable and in that comfort dismiss the truth of God. Robinson Crusoe's father also makes this statement, and this is one of the reasons why I want us to go and read things like Robinson Crusoe. You will find that a lot of the arguments you've been told about history are not true, and they're easily disprovable by just reading the old books. You've been told that all these things, they're modern inventions. And it might be true that only in the modern world did they start to come about, but they're not actually modern inventions. It's not uncommon to hear, the furrowed brow pastor in the pulpit say, the modern pick me up by my bootstraps idea, that's just a part of American stuff. That's not actually biblical. That's an American sensibility. Actually, no, that is a biblical sensibility. When God says to Cain in Genesis 4, if you do well, you will be accepted. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. That is pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We've been lied about history. Okay, so the middle class, that appears in chapter 1. Now, Robinson Crusoe, he dismisses his father's advice, and he goes and runs away. And then you get some calamities start to happen in his life. There's a lot of stuff about slavery in this book, too. It's a really interesting book. Or there's stuff about slavery early on in it. A bad storm comes about, and the ship that he's on has kind of a small disaster. He repents and says, I'll go back home. But then the storm goes away, and he actually turns back on his repentance. He gives up the repentance and says, I actually can't handle this. We see people do this all the time. We do this all the time. These are things that, I can speak about because I'm familiar with it. You feel guilty about a sin, you repent of it, and then you get comfortable with it. And your repentance is thrown away. That's a bad thing, by the way. It's a very damnable thing. Don't do that. But then Robinson Crusoe has a real shipwreck, and that's what lands him in slavery. But in the midst of all that, he makes the statement that he says, a man is not ashamed to sin, and yet he is ashamed to repent. Now, he's not ashamed of that thing which that thing which ought justly esteem him a fool. However, he is ashamed of returning, which simply would make him a wise man. And now what Daniel Defoe is writing here, and I'm reading one of the older versions of it. If you listen to the one on LibriVox, it's modernized in modern English, so it's a lot easier to read. But he's saying if someone will proudly sin, you see people do this all the time, they'll double down on something. Repenting from the sin, nobody would actually think ill of them if they do it. But for some reason, I don't want to hurt my reputation. I want to look like the tough guy, so I'm going to double down on my sin. That makes me a fool when I double down on my sin, but I'm ashamed to admit that I was wrong. I don't want to admit that I'm wrong, so I'm going to openly be a fool. There's a captain of another ship, and after they're shipwrecked, and Robinson Crusoe ends up on land, and there's a lot of things that happen. Another man from another boat says, I would not have you on my boat. If your father told you not to be a sailor, you repented of becoming a sailor and then turned back on it, and then a calamity happened, you're bad luck. Don't come around here. The other sailors, they don't think Robinson Crusoe is tough for wanting to get on the sea. They actually think he's a fool because so many sides of God have told him not to get on the sea, and he does it anyway. But yet he wants to look tough, so he doubles down. Okay, in chapter 2, there's another statement that you get from Robinson Crusoe that's pretty cool. He says, for now the hand of heaven had overtaken me, and I was to be undone without redemption. Again, we do see a lot of calamities happen. Robinson Crusoe, he ends up spending some time as a slave. He actually spends 2 years of his life as a slave. He then goes on to try to trade in the slave business, and that's what ends him in the condition of being shipwrecked altogether. And what you find here is this idea that we, in our sinful state, look at God and we think, I've been landed in calamity. And without any chance of redemption, I'm just going to suffer without any point. And really, the reason why I have this quote here that I want us to talk about, and this is less talking about the book and just more how the world really operates. Heaven calls us to suffer for a higher purpose. Hell calls us to suffer just for the sake of suffering. Now, in our sinful state, we look up at the hand of heaven and we think, God is making me suffer without point, when it's actually God who wants us to find the higher purpose. Hell is the one that wants you to be undone without redemption. A lot of times we're like Robinson Crusoe. In chapter 3, he is down in South America, and he makes a statement, if I used half of the energy I spent being prudent to look into my own interest, as I did in doing sinful things, then I would have been blessed. And a lot of times, again, we spend more energy thinking about how we might better sin than what we ought to actually do. There's no shortage of situations in our world where people are doing wicked things. Wicked things like transgender surgeries, sexual immorality just abound. And it's very clear that things like homosexuality, they're not just a different choice of sexuality. They're actually vectors for a lot of other dysfunction. They come, you see, there's a lot of molestation that goes in that leads people down that pathway. A lot of negligence on fathers. There's a lot of different variables that you find there. But it also is a bit of a carrier for other things. And again, I am not saying this out of some point of cruelty. I'm just being honest about the world. It's actually interesting in Isidore of Seville's Etymologies, and the topic of sodomy, it's described and classified as an addictive vice that leads to greater and worse vices, meaning more extreme vices. That's one of the reasons why you can't permit this in your society, and it is indeed true. But with the transgender thing, a lot of times, or even with the issue of AIDS, people say, oh, well, rather than stop doing the things which leads to AIDS, why don't we get new drugs that mask that? Or at least mask the symptoms of it, even though you could still spread it? Or why don't we try to become better at the surgery so that we're not, whatever. Rather than thinking about what we ought to do, we think about how we might perfect our sin. In the modern world, and in many ways, it is designed to insulate the sins, to cast out the virtues and insulate the sins so that we can break the natural law, so that we don't have the consequences of the sin, which is actually there. In chapter 4 of Robinson Crusoe, he actually ends up on a desert mile. And he spends some time wondering why he was saved and while the others were lost. Why was it that Providence placed him on a shore when everyone else died? And we're going to end our whole podcast today with a quote from Paradise Lost, where man looks at God and says, did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me, man? Did I solicit thee that from darkness thou should promote me? We don't have a choice in the talents that are given to us. We do have a choice in how we use them. In America, we've been given a marvelous heritage. We have a choice in how we're going to use that. Thank you for joining me. I'm Pastor J. Dillon Proctor. This is the Poetry of the Constitution, the beginning, part 1. God love you, and have a blessed day.